Richard's presentation the next day was a disaster. Not because he wasn't prepared, but because he couldn't focus. Every time he looked at the board members, he saw the faces of those passengers on the plane. Every time he tried to make a confident statement, he heard his own voice making those cruel assumptions about Keanu. He stumbled through his pitch, and afterward, his business partner pulled him aside. "What happened to you? That wasn't like you at all." "I had a rough flight," Richard said, which was both true and a massive understatement. That evening in his hotel room, Richard made the mistake of searching social media. It didn't take long to find the posts. None of them named him directly, but they didn't need to. Just witnessed the most entitled businessman harass Keanu Reeves on a flight for 3 hours. Keanu was nothing but gracious. The businessman looked like he wanted to die when he realized who he'd been insulting. Faith in humanity, mixed emotions. The post had 17,000 likes and counting. The comments were brutal. "This is why I hate rich people. They think they're better than everyone." Imagine being that guy right now, probably Googling how to disappear forever. Keanu Reeves is literally famous for being humble, and this dude judged him on his clothes. Says everything about society. Richard closed the app, but the damage was done. Even though he wasn't named, he felt exposed, like the entire internet was looking directly at him and seeing him for who he really was. The story picked up steam over the next few days. Entertainment websites started writing articles. Keanu Reeves reportedly harassed on flight responds with characteristic grace. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes about it. Someone even created a meme with Keanu's face and the caption, "When you're worth millions but still get judged for wearing jeans." Richard's business partner figured out he was the businessman in question. "Please tell me that wasn't you," he said over the phone. Richard couldn't lie. "It was me." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, his partner said, "What were you thinking?" "I wasn't," Richard admitted. "I was being a jerk. I took out my bad week on someone who didn't deserve it. Do you realize how bad this could be if someone connects you to this story? We're trying to close deals. We need people to trust us, to like us." "I know," Richard said miserably. Over the next few weeks, Richard became paranoid. Every time he walked into a meeting, he wondered if the people there had heard the story. Every time someone looked at him oddly, he wondered if they'd put it together. He started having trouble sleeping, the shame eating at him constantly. But something else was happening too. He started noticing his own behavior in a way he never had before. How quickly he judged people. How often he made assumptions based on appearance. How he treated service workers versus how he treated fellow executives. One day, at his favorite coffee shop, he caught himself about to complain that his latte wasn't hot enough. The barista was a young guy, probably in college, who looked tired. Richard opened his mouth to demand a remake, then stopped. He thought about Keanu's kindness to the flight attendant. He thought about how that little girl's father was serving overseas while Richard complained about coffee temperature. "Actually," Richard said, "this is fine, thank you." The barista looked surprised but grateful. "You sure? I can make you a new one if it's not right." "No, it's perfect," Richard said, and he meant it. Small changes started adding up. He stopped being short with his assistant. He started saying thank you to people who held doors. He caught himself making a snap judgment about someone's appearance and actively chose to challenge that thought. But the biggest change came 3 months later. Richard was at a charity gala, something his business partner had dragged him to. He wasn't particularly interested in being there, still feeling raw from the flight incident and generally wanting to avoid public events. That's when he saw Keanu across the room. Richard's first instinct was to hide, to avoid any possibility of another encounter. But then he thought about the past 3 months, about all the ways that one flight had changed him, and he knew he had to do something. He took a breath and walked over. Keanu was talking with some organizers of the event, listening intently to their description of the charity's work with sick children. When there was a pause in the conversation, Richard approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Could I speak with you for just a moment?" Keanu looked at him, and there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Of course," he said graciously, excusing himself from the other conversation. They stepped to a quieter corner of the room. Richard's heart was pounding. "You probably don't remember me," Richard started. "I remember," Keanu said gently. "Of course he did. I needed to talk to you again. To apologize again, but more than that. I need you to know that what happened on that flight changed me. Keanu listened, his expression open and curious. I've spent the last 3 months really looking at myself, Richard continued, at how I treat people, at what I value, at who I've become. And I didn't like what I saw. You were right when you asked if it would have mattered who you were. It shouldn't have. But I was someone who judged people on their appearance, on their perceived status. I was someone who needed to feel superior, to feel good about myself. And now? Keanu asked, echoing his question from the plane. Now I'm trying to be better, Richard said. I'm working with a therapist. I volunteer at a food bank on weekends. I've started really listening to people instead of just waiting for my turn to talk. And I got involved with this charity. He gestured to the gala around them. Because I wanted to be part of something that actually helps people. Keanu nodded slowly. That's good. That's really good. I'm not telling you this to make you think better of me, Richard said quickly. I'm telling you because that day on the plane you showed me what kindness looks like. Even when someone is treating you terribly, you stayed kind. You were gracious to that little girl. You accepted my apology even though you had no reason to. And that stuck with me. It showed me who I wanted to be instead of who I was. Can I tell you something? Keanu said. That wasn't even a particularly bad day for me. I've been insulted before. People make assumptions all the time. What made that day different was watching you realize what you'd done and seeing it really affect you. A lot of people would have just shrugged it off, blamed it on having a bad day and moved on, but you actually let it change you. Richard felt emotion welling up in his throat. It was the worst moment of my life. But also maybe the most important. Growth usually comes from discomfort, Keanu said. Sounds like you're doing the work. They talked for a few more minutes. Keanu told him about the charity, how they helped families dealing with childhood cancer, how the medical bills and emotional toll could be devastating. Richard found himself genuinely engaged, asking questions, wanting to understand. I'd like to help, Richard said. Can I make a donation? Of course, Keanu said. But more than that, this organization needs volunteers. People who can spend time with families, help with fundraising, spread the word. I can do that, Richard said. I will do that. As they parted ways, Keanu shook his hand. I'm glad you came over tonight. Takes courage to face something like this. Takes courage to forgive, Richard countered. Maybe we both have courage then, Keanu said with a smile. Over the next year, Richard became deeply involved with the charity. He used his business connections to set up fundraisers. He spent weekends visiting families in the hospital, just sitting with parents who needed someone to talk to. He learned the names of kids going through treatment and checked in on them regularly. His business partner noticed the change. You're different, he said one day. Softer somehow, but also, I don't know, more real. I'm working on being a better person, Richard explained. Turns out I had a lot of room for improvement. His relationships changed too. His assistant, who he'd always kept at arm's length, became someone he actually talked to like a human being. He learned about her family, her goals, her life outside of work. His business meetings became less about dominating and more about collaborating. The story of the flight incident eventually faded from social media, replaced by newer stories and different scandals. But Richard never forgot it. He kept a reminder on his phone, a note he'd written to himself. How you treat people when you think they're beneath you shows who you really are. One day, about 18 months after the flight, Richard was in an airport again. He was waiting for a different flight when he saw a man struggling with his bags while trying to manage 2 small kids. The man was dressed in worn clothes, clearly stressed, clearly overwhelmed. Old Richard would have looked away, annoyed by the chaos. But new Richard walked over. Hey, can I help you with those bags? The man looked surprised. Really? That would be amazing, thank you. Richard helped him get organized, even entertained the kids for a minute while the man got their boarding passes sorted out. It was a small thing. Took maybe 5 minutes of his time, but the relief on the man's face made it worth it. Thank you so much, the man said. People aren't usually this nice in airports. Just paying forward some kindness someone showed me once, Richard said. As he walked back to his gate, Richard thought about that flight with Keanu. He thought about how one afternoon, one series of poor choices, had completely altered the course of his life. If he hadn't been seated next to Keanu, would he have ever changed? Would he have kept being that judgmental, superior person for the rest of his life? He'd never know the answer. But he was grateful for what had happened, as painful as it was. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most valuable ones. His phone buzzed with a text from the charity coordinator. They were planning a big fundraising event and wanted Richard to help organize it. He smiled and typed back that he'd be happy to help. The old Richard would have done it for the networking opportunities, for the chance to be seen doing something good. The new Richard did it because it actually mattered. Because sick kids needed help. Because families were struggling. Because he'd learned that real fulfillment didn't come from feeling superior to others. It came from lifting others up. He boarded his flight, this time treating every interaction as an opportunity to be kind. He thanked the gate agent. He helped an elderly woman with her bag. He smiled at the flight attendant and meant it when he said he appreciated her work. And when he sat down in his seat, he noticed the person next to him was dressed casually, reading a book, looking completely at peace. Richard smiled to himself, pulled out his own book, and settled in for the flight. No judgments. No assumptions. Just two people sharing space on a journey. That's what Keanu had taught him. That's what that terrible transformative day had given him. A chance to be better. A chance to be the person he should have been all along. And Richard was determined never to waste that chance again. The next hour of the flight was the longest of Richard's life. He sat there, paralyzed by embarrassment, while his mind replayed every single thing he'd said. Every insult, every snide comment, every judgmental look, and the person he'd directed them all at was Keanu Reeves. Not that it should have mattered who it was, but somehow knowing made the shame even more intense. Richard wanted to apologize. He needed to apologize, but every time he opened his mouth to speak, the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say? Sorry I treated you like garbage because of your clothes? Sorry I assumed you were beneath me? Sorry I'm apparently a terrible person? Keanu had gone back to reading his philosophy book, completely peaceful, like the last 3 hours hadn't happened. That grace, that ability to just let it go, made Richard feel even worse. He almost wished Keanu would get angry, would call him out, would make a scene. At least then Richard could respond to something, but this quiet dignity was impossible to respond to. Around them, the atmosphere in first class had completely shifted. Where before there had been the usual quiet hum of isolated travelers minding their own business, now there was a sense of community. People who'd witnessed what happened kept glancing over. Not at Keanu exactly, but in his direction, like they were all sharing in the warmth of that interaction with Lily, and they were all very pointedly not looking at Richard. The flight attendant came by again with the beverage cart. When she reached their row, she smiled warmly at Keanu. Are you sure I can't get you anything? We have some excellent wine, or the meal service will be coming around again soon if you're hungry. I'm really okay, thank you, Keanu said with that same genuine kindness he'd shown everyone. You're doing an amazing job. She beamed at the compliment, then turned to Richard. Her smile didn't disappear, but it definitely cooled several degrees. And for you, sir? Nothing, Richard said quietly. He couldn't even look at her. After she left, Richard heard whispers from the row behind him. Two business travelers were talking in low voices, but not quite low enough. Can you believe that guy? I know, who treats someone like that? It's like even if it wasn't Keanu Reeves, who does that? And the fact that it was Keanu makes it so much worse. The guy is literally famous for being humble and taking the subway and being nice to crew members. I'm definitely tweeting about this later. Not naming names, but people should know this happened. Richard's stomach churned. Of course people were going to post about this. In this age, everything got posted. By tomorrow, there could be dozens of tweets and posts about entitled businessman harasses humble celebrity on flight. They wouldn't name him, but people he knew would recognize the details. His business partners, his clients, his ex-wife who would absolutely use it against him. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd taken earlier. The one he'd sent to his partner with that smug message. He quickly deleted it from his phone, then the message thread, like that would somehow erase what he'd done. But he knew his partner had already seen it. The screenshot probably already existed somewhere. Richard's hands were shaking. He gripped his phone tighter, trying to control the trembling, but it wasn't working. Everything he'd worked for, his reputation as a successful businessman, his image as someone who'd made it, someone who deserved respect, all of it felt like it was crumbling. And for what? Because he'd been having a bad week and took it out on a stranger? Because he'd judged someone based on their clothes? Because he needed to feel superior to someone, anyone? Are you okay? The voice startled him. It was Keanu, looking at him with what appeared to be genuine concern. Richard almost laughed. Here he was, drowning in shame over how he'd treated this man, and Keanu was asking if he was okay. "I'm fine," Richard said, but his voice cracked on the words. "You don't seem fine," Keanu said gently. "You seem pretty upset." "I am upset," Richard admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I'm upset because I was a complete jerk to you for 3 hours straight, and you were nothing but kind, and now I find out you're Keanu Reeves, and I feel like the biggest idiot on the planet." Keanu was quiet for a moment. "Is it because I'm Keanu Reeves? Or is it because you realize how you treated another person?" The question hit Richard like a slap. Both?" he said honestly. "But you're right. It shouldn't matter who you are." "I shouldn't have treated anyone like that." "But you did," Keanu said, not unkindly. "So the question is why?" Richard had never been good at self-reflection. He was a man of action, of results, of moving forward. But sitting here, trapped at 30,000 feet with no escape from the consequences of his behavior, he found himself actually thinking about it. "I think," he said slowly, "I needed to feel better than someone. I've had a terrible week, deals falling through, money problems, my ex-wife demanding more alimony, and when I saw you sitting there dressed casually, being humbled, declining champagne, I assumed you were struggling or that you didn't belong, and it made me feel better about my own problems." Keanu nodded, listening without judgment. "And now? Now I feel like the person who doesn't belong," Richard said quietly. "You were kind to that little girl. You're kind to the flight attendants. You're even being kind to me right now after how I treated you. And I'm the guy who judges people based on their clothes and makes assumptions about strangers. So you've learned something," Keanu said simply. "I've learned I'm not as good of a person as I thought I was," Richard said bitterly. "Or you've learned that you have room to grow," Keanu countered. "Look, I don't know you, but I know that people having bad weeks sometimes do things they regret. The question is what you do with that regret." Richard finally looked directly at Keanu. "I want to apologize. A real apology. Not because you're famous, but because I was wrong. I treated you badly. I made assumptions, I was rude and cruel, and you didn't deserve any of it. I'm sorry." Keanu held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted." "Just like that?" Richard asked, surprised. "Just like that," Keanu confirmed. "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right." But Richard wasn't sure he'd made things right. An apology was just words. It didn't undo what happened. It didn't erase the judgment of the other passengers or the potential social media posts or the fundamental truth that he'd revealed something ugly about himself. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we're beginning our descent into New York. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin. Only 30 minutes left." Richard would be off this plane soon, back in his real life, but he knew he'd be carrying this experience with him for a long time. The businessman from a few rows up walked past on his way to the bathroom. As he passed Richard's seat, he made deliberate eye contact and shook his head slowly, the disappointment clear on his face. It was a small gesture, but it landed hard. A few minutes later, a woman stopped in the aisle. She was maybe in her 50s, well-dressed in business attire. She looked at Keanu with a warm smile. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan. My son and I watch your movies together all the time. You seem like such a genuinely good person." "That's very kind, thank you," Keanu said warmly. The woman glanced at Richard, and her expression changed completely. It was like a door slamming shut. She looked back at Keanu. "I'm sorry you had to deal with rudeness today. You handled it with more grace than I would have." After she walked away, Richard felt tears pricking at his eyes. He hadn't cried in years, prided himself on being tough and unemotional, but right now he felt like he might actually break down. The flight attendant announced that they'd be landing soon and to prepare for arrival. Richard mechanically fastened his seatbelt, put his tablet away, brought his seat to the upright position. All the normal actions felt surreal, like he was moving through water. His phone buzzed again. Another message from his business partner. "Just Googled it. That's definitely Keanu. He's literally one of the nicest guys in Hollywood. Multiple stories about him being humble and generous." "Dude, what were you thinking?" Richard didn't reply. He couldn't explain what he'd been thinking because he wasn't sure he'd been thinking at all. He'd just been reacting, judging, lashing out at someone who happened to be sitting next to him. As the plane descended, Richard looked out the window at New York City coming into view. All those buildings, all those people, all those lives being lived, and he was just one person among millions, not nearly as important or special as he'd always told himself he was. The wheels touched down with a bump. They'd landed. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began standing up, gathering their things, preparing to leave. Richard stayed in his seat, not quite ready to face what came next. Keanu stood up and reached for his bag in the overhead compartment. He pulled it down with easy grace, then glanced at Richard. "Good luck with your presentation tomorrow." Richard blinked. "How did you know I have a presentation?" "You mentioned it earlier before." Keanu trailed off tactfully. "Before I started insulting you," Richard thought. "Thank you," he said quietly. Keanu gave him a small nod, then made his way off the plane. As he walked up the aisle, Richard could see other passengers smiling at him, some shaking his hand, one person asking for a photo. Keanu was gracious with everyone, taking time, being present. Richard was the last person off the plane. As he walked through first class, he could feel the judgment of the flight attendants who'd witnessed everything. In the jet bridge, he saw a group of passengers who'd been on his flight talking animatedly, phones out. He knew they were sharing the story. By tomorrow, his behavior would be all over social media. And even if his name wasn't attached, he would know. He would carry this with him forever. Richard had been staring out the window for about 20 minutes, trying to ignore the tension he'd created in the cabin. His champagne glass was empty again, but he didn't want to call the flight attendant. He could feel the judgment from the other passengers, and it was starting to make him uncomfortable in a way he wasn't used to feeling. The man in the leather jacket had pulled out a notebook and was writing something by hand, actually writing with a pen like some kind of throwback. Richard glanced over despite himself and saw neat handwriting filling the page. He couldn't make out the words, but there was something thoughtful about the way the man paused between sentences, like he was carefully considering each word. That's when Richard heard a small voice from the aisle. "Excuse me." He looked up to see a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing nervously in the aisle. She had dark curly hair pulled into 2 ponytails and was wearing a purple t-shirt with a cartoon character on it. Her eyes were fixed on the man in the leather jacket, wide with something that looked like awe. Behind her stood a woman in her 30s, presumably her mother, with an apologetic expression on her face. "I'm so sorry to bother you," the mother said, her voice hushed and respectful. "We're sitting back in economy, but my daughter recognized you when we were boarding and she's been begging me for the last hour to let her come up and say hello." Richard's brain stuttered, trying to process this. Recognized him, what? The man in the leather jacket's entire face transformed. The calm, peaceful expression he'd maintained through all of Richard's insults melted into something warm and genuinely delighted. "Hey there," he said to the little girl, his voice soft and kind. "What's your name?" "Lily," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was clutching something in her hands, maybe a napkin or a piece of paper. "That's a beautiful name," the man said, giving her his full attention in a way that seemed to put her at ease. "How old are you, Lily?" 8, she said, gaining a bit of confidence. "And I know this is probably weird, but you're my dad's favorite actor in the whole world and mine too. We watched John Wick together like 5 times. Richard's stomach dropped. "John Wick, the action movie? The one with, no way, 5 times? The man said, his eyes twinkling. "That's a lot. Your dad has good taste." "He's deployed right now," Lily continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. "He's in the Navy and he's overseas, and he made me promise to watch all your movies while he was gone, so we could talk about them when he gets back. And I've seen The Matrix too, and you were so cool in it. And my dad says you do all your own stunts and that you're the nicest person in Hollywood, and..." She ran out of breath, her cheeks flushing pink with excitement and nervousness. The mother put her hand on Lily's shoulder. "Honey, take a breath." She looked at the man apologetically. "I'm sorry. She practiced a whole speech on the plane, but I think excitement took over." The man laughed, and it was a genuine warm sound. "That's the best kind of speech. Lily, it means so much to me that you and your dad watch the movies together, and thank you for telling me about your dad. Please thank him for his service, okay? What he's doing is really important." Lily nodded vigorously. "He comes home in 3 months." "I bet you're counting down the days," the man said. "We have a calendar and everything," Lily confirmed. Richard sat frozen in his seat. his mind trying to catch up with what was happening. This was Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. The man he'd been insulting for the past 3 hours was one of the most famous actors in the world. Someone who'd been in massive blockbuster movies. Someone who was, according to everything Richard had ever heard, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His hands started to tremble. Would it be okay? Lily asked shyly. Holding up what Richard could now see was a napkin. If you signed this? My dad would totally freak out. In a good way. I would love to, Keanu said. He pulled out his pen, the same one he'd been writing in his notebook with. What should I write? Maybe to Lily and her dad and then your name. Lily suggested. How about this, Keanu said, taking the napkin and writing carefully. He spoke as he wrote. To Lily and her dad, thank you for your service and for being awesome fans. You're breathtaking. He signed his name with a flourish and handed it back to her. Lily's face lit up like Christmas morning. You said the line. From the meme, Keanu grinned. Had to. It's tradition now. Other passengers were watching this interaction, and Richard noticed several of them had their phones out. Not to bother Keanu, but to capture this moment from a respectful distance. Smiles were spreading through the first-class cabin. The cold disapproval that had been directed at Richard was now transformed into warmth directed at this exchange. Wait, Keanu said, flagging down a flight attendant. When she came over, he asked, Do you have any of those wing pins? The ones you give to kids? Of course, she said, and quickly retrieved one from a compartment. Keanu took it and handed it to Lily. This is for you. Official wings. You can be my co-pilot. Lily clutched the pin like it was made of gold. This is the best day ever. Her mother's eyes were glistening with tears. You have no idea how much this means to her. To both of them. My husband talks about your movies all the time. He loves that you're a good person, that you treat people with respect. He says that matters more than any role you play. Something in those words hit Richard like a physical blow. Keanu looked genuinely touched. That means everything. Really. And Lily, you keep watching movies with your dad when he gets home, okay? That time together is special. I will, Lily promised. Thank you so much. As the mother and daughter started to walk back toward economy, Lily turned around one more time. You really are breathtaking, she said, then giggled and hurried away. Keanu watched them go with a smile, then settled back into his seat. The cabin was buzzing now with whispered conversations. Richard heard snippets. That was so sweet. He's such a good guy, and did you see how kind he was to her? The older woman across the aisle leaned over, and this time she didn't hold back. She looked directly at Richard and said quietly but firmly, That's Keanu Reeves, one of the most successful actors in the world, worth more money than you'll probably ever see, and known for being humble and kind to everyone he meets. And you just spent 3 hours treating him like garbage. Richard couldn't speak. His throat had closed up. His face was burning with shame so intense it was almost painful. The woman continued, her voice cutting but not cruel. My grandson loves him. Not just because he's in great movies, but because there are dozens of stories about him giving up his seat on the subway, taking pay cuts so crew members could get better wages, donating millions to children's hospitals anonymously. He's famous for being decent. She paused, letting that sink in. You judged him based on his jacket and jeans. You assumed you were better than him because of how he dressed. Does that feel good right now? Richard shook his head mutely. He felt like he might be sick. The woman sat back in her seat, having said her piece. Around them, other passengers were stealing glances at Richard, and he could see the judgment in their eyes. But more than that, he could see disappointment. Like he'd confirmed something ugly about human nature that they'd hoped wasn't true. Keanu, for his part, had gone back to his notebook like nothing had happened. He didn't seem upset or vindictive. He just seemed unbothered. Like Richard's behavior had been nothing more than background noise to him. That somehow made it worse. Richard's phone buzzed. His business partner had replied to the photo he'd sent earlier. Dude, is that who I think it is? That looks like Keanu Reeves. Did you seriously just send me a pic making fun of Keanu Reeves? Richard stared at the message. Another text came through. If that's him, you better delete that first message before someone sees it. People love that guy. You'll look like a complete tool. Too late, Richard thought. He already looked like a complete tool. To everyone in this cabin who'd witnessed his behavior. To himself. He glanced at Keanu, who was still writing peacefully in his notebook. Richard noticed details he'd missed before. The leather jacket, while worn, was actually high quality. The jeans fit perfectly. The whole look wasn't sloppy at all. It was intentional, comfortable, confident. It was the look of someone who had nothing to prove. Unlike Richard, who apparently had everything to prove and had just proven all the wrong things. The flight attendant came by, and Richard noticed how her whole demeanor had changed. She was professional to him, nothing more. But when she looked at Keanu, her expression softened. "Can I get you anything?" "Anything at all?" "I'm good, thank you," Keanu said warmly. "But I appreciate you taking such good care of everyone." After she left, Richard found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "I didn't know," he said, his voice hoarse. Keanu looked over at him calmly. "Know what?" "Who you were." Richard couldn't meet his eyes. "I didn't recognize you." Keanu was quiet for a moment, then said something that cut deeper than any anger could have. "Would it have mattered?" Richard opened his mouth to say yes, of course it would have mattered, but the words stuck in his throat. Because he realized what Keanu was really asking. Would it have mattered if Keanu had been just some regular guy? If he really had been a roadie or a delivery person or someone working a normal job, would that have made Richard's behavior okay? The answer was obvious, and it made Richard feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. "It shouldn't have mattered," Richard finally said, barely above a whisper. "No," Keanu agreed gently. "It shouldn't have." Richard sat there drowning in shame while around him the cabin slowly returned to normal. But he knew nothing felt normal anymore. In the span of one small interaction with a little girl, his entire afternoon, his entire view of himself, had been turned completely upside down. And the worst part was knowing he'd done it to himself. Richard ordered his fourth glass of champagne. The alcohol was loosening his tongue, making him bolder, less careful about keeping his thoughts to himself. He'd always been someone who said what he thought. But usually he had enough self-control to keep the really harsh comments internal. Not today, though. Today, everything that had gone wrong over the past week was bubbling up. And this guy next to him had become the target. The man in the leather jacket had put his philosophy book away and was now just sitting quietly, occasionally looking out the window. He seemed lost in thought, completely at peace. That peaceful attitude was driving Richard crazy. How could someone be so calm and content while dressed like they'd just rolled out of bed? Richard shifted in his seat, making sure his movement was noticeable. He wanted to project his annoyance, his disapproval. He pulled out his tablet and started scrolling through his social media, shaking his head and sighing loudly. The flight attendant came by again, checking on passengers. When she reached their row, her face lit up when she looked at Richard's seatmate. "Is there anything at all I can get for you? Anything special you'd like?" "I'm really fine, thank you," the man said warmly. "You're doing a great job." "Well, please let me know if you need anything at all," she said, almost gushing. After she walked away, Richard couldn't hold back anymore. He let out a loud, sarcastic laugh. "Wow, you've really got the staff wrapped around your finger. What did you do, tip them before the flight?" The man turned to look at him, his expression curious rather than offended. "Sorry, did you say something to me?" "Nothing," Richard said, his voice dripping with fake innocence. "Just noticing how some people work the system, that's all." "I'm not sure what you mean," the man said gently. Richard leaned back in his seat, emboldened by the champagne and his own frustration. "Look, I'm just saying that first class used to mean something. Used to be a certain standard. Now they let anyone on with enough credit card points or some lucky upgrade." The man's expression didn't change. He just nodded slowly like he was considering the comment. "I see. That bothers you?" "Yeah, it bothers me," Richard said, his voice getting louder. A few passengers in nearby seats glanced over. "I work hard. I built a business from scratch. When I sit in first class, I'm sitting with people who understand what it means to earn your place, not just people who got lucky." "That makes sense," the man said. And for some reason, his complete lack of defensiveness made Richard even angrier. "You're not even going to defend yourself?" Richard challenged. "Defend myself from what?" the man asked, genuinely seeming confused. "From the fact that you clearly don't belong here," Richard said bluntly. An older woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, catching Richard's eye. She had a concerned look on her face and seemed like she wanted to say something, but Richard ignored her. He was on a roll now, and the champagne had dissolved whatever filter he normally maintained. The man in the leather jacket took a slow breath and said calmly, "I'm sorry you feel that way. I didn't mean to upset you by sitting here." "You didn't upset me," Richard snapped back. "I just think airlines need better standards. That's all." "Okay," the man said simply, and turned his attention back to the window. That single word, that complete lack of engagement, made Richard feel like he was talking to a wall. He wanted an argument. He wanted this guy to push back so he could really let loose and prove his point. Instead, he got nothing but calm acceptance, which somehow felt worse than any argument would have. Richard flagged down the flight attendant. When she arrived, he made sure to speak loudly enough for his seatmate to hear. "Excuse me, I was just curious about your upgrade policy. How do people usually end up in first class? Is it mostly purchases, or do you do a lot of free upgrades these days?" The flight attendant looked uncomfortable. "Well, sir, most of our first-class passengers purchase their tickets directly. We do occasionally offer upgrades to our loyalty program members or in special circumstances." "Special circumstances," Richard repeated, nodding knowingly. "Right, that's what I thought." The flight attendant glanced at the man in the leather jacket, then back at Richard. She seemed torn between maintaining professional courtesy and defending someone. Finally, she just said, "Can I get you anything else, sir?" "Another champagne," Richard said, handing her his empty glass. After she left, Richard pulled out his phone and, right in front of his seatmate, angled it to take a photo. He captured a shot that showed the leather jacket and the worn jeans. He immediately started typing a message to his business partner. "First class ain't what it used to be. Look at this." He hit send with an exaggerated motion, making sure the man next to him could see what he was doing. The man glanced at the phone, then at Richard, and just gave a small shrug. "If that makes you feel better," he said quietly. "It does, actually," Richard said defiantly. "People need to know that standards are slipping. You used to be able to count on certain spaces being reserved for certain types of people." "What types of people?" the man asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than confrontational. "Professionals. People who've achieved something. People who dress appropriately and understand social expectations." Richard was gesturing now, getting more animated. "Not just anyone who wanders in wearing whatever they found in their closet." Several passengers were openly watching now. The older woman across the aisle looked distressed. A businessman 2 rows up had taken off his headphones and was frowning in their direction. But Richard didn't care. He was right, and everyone else was just too politically correct to say it. The man in the leather jacket was quiet for a moment, then said, "I can understand wanting to feel like you belong somewhere special. That's important to you," Richard blinked. He hadn't expected that response. It was so understanding, so kind even. It threw him off balance for a second, but he recovered quickly. This isn't about feelings. It's about standards. It's about maintaining quality. "And you think the way someone dresses determines their quality?" the man asked, still in that same gentle tone. "It's one factor, yes," Richard said defensively. "Presentation matters. It shows respect. It shows you care about where you are and who you're with." "I see," the man said, nodding. "So if I'd worn a suit, you would have been okay with me sitting here?" Richard was about to say yes, but something about the question felt like a trap. He backtracked. "It's not just the clothes. It's the whole package. The attitude, the sophistication, the awareness. And you don't think I have those things?" the man asked, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Honestly, no," Richard said flatly. "You ordered water instead of champagne. You're reading philosophy books. You declined the premium meal options. You're sitting there like you don't even care that you're in first class. It's like you don't appreciate it." The man considered this. "Maybe I appreciate it differently than you do." "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard demanded. "Just that comfort and luxury can mean different things to different people," the man said. "For me, it's nice to have space and quiet." "That's enough," Richard scoffed. "That's what economy is for. First class is supposed to be about the experience, the service, the prestige." "The prestige," the man repeated, like he was tasting the word. "That's important to you." "Yes, it is," Richard said firmly. "I worked my whole life to get to a place where I could afford these things, where I could sit in first class and know I earned it. So yeah, prestige matters." The flight attendant returned with Richard's champagne. As she handed it to him, she looked at the man in the leather jacket with an expression that Richard could only describe as apologetic. The man just smiled at her reassuringly and shook his head slightly, like he was telling her not to worry. That small interaction made Richard even angrier. Now the staff was feeling sorry for this guy, like he was the victim here. Richard was the one who should be getting sympathy. He was the paying customer who had to sit next to someone completely inappropriate for first class. He took a long drink of his champagne and decided to push further. "So what do you do anyway?" "For work?" The man looked at him, seeming to debate how to answer. "I'm in entertainment." Richard nearly choked on his drink. "Entertainment? What, like party planning or something?" "Something like that," the man said with a slight smile. "Let me guess," Richard said, leaning back with a smug expression. "You're probably a roadie for some band. Or maybe you set up equipment for events. That would explain the clothes." "I do work with a lot of equipment and people," the man said, not correcting him but not exactly confirming either. Richard felt validated. He'd pegged this guy correctly. Some kind of working-class entertainment industry person, probably makes decent money but has no sense of how to present himself in refined settings. The kind of person who thinks jeans are appropriate everywhere. "See, that's what I mean," Richard said, gesturing with his glass. "Entertainment industry people, especially the technical folks, you guys make okay money sometimes. But you don't have the polish. You don't get the culture of spaces like this." A man sitting diagonal to them, who'd been watching this whole exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Hey buddy, maybe you should give it a rest." Richard turned to him. "Excuse me? I'm having a private conversation." "A private conversation that the whole cabin can hear," the man said. "And honestly, you're being pretty rude." Richard felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. "I'm being honest. There's a difference." "No," the man said firmly. "You're being a jerk." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the man had already put his headphones back on and turned away. The older woman across the aisle was shaking her head with clear disapproval. Even some of the other business-class passengers who'd initially seemed neutral were now looking at Richard with cold expressions. The man in the leather jacket just sat there, still calm, still unbothered. "It's okay," he said quietly to Richard. "You're obviously having a rough time. We all have bad days." That kindness, that completely undeserved grace was the final straw for Richard. He couldn't handle it. He turned toward the window, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his champagne glass so tightly his knuckles were white. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. The flight attendants moved through quietly, avoiding eye contact with Richard. Other passengers whispered to each other, some pulling out their phones. Richard stared out at the clouds, feeling a strange mix of righteous indignation and something else he couldn't quite name. Something that felt uncomfortably like doubt. The Los Angeles airport was packed that Tuesday afternoon. Business travelers rushed through security. Families dragged oversized luggage, and flight announcements echoed through the terminal. Gate 42 was boarding a direct flight to New York, and the first-class passengers were already lining up. Richard checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. He was always early, always prepared, always in control. That's how he'd built his tech company from nothing into a multi-million-dollar business. At 42 years old, he wore success like a second skin. His Italian suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he knew it. The past week had been brutal, though. 2 major deals had fallen through. His biggest investor was getting cold feet, and his ex-wife's lawyer kept calling about increasing alimony payments. Richard was in no mood for delays, incompetence, or anything less than perfection. As he walked down the jet bridge, he felt some of his tension ease. First class was his sanctuary. No screaming kids, no middle seats, no fighting for overhead space. Just leather seats, premium service, and people who understood the value of discretion and personal space. He found his seat. 2A, right by the window. Perfect, he could work on his laptop, maybe catch some sleep and avoid unnecessary conversation. Richard stowed his leather briefcase in the overhead compartment and settled in, already mentally reviewing the presentation he'd give in New York tomorrow. That's when he noticed someone taking the seat next to him. Richard glanced over and immediately felt his jaw tighten. The guy sliding into seat 2C looked like he'd just walked off a motorcycle. Faded jeans with actual wear marks, a black t-shirt, and a brown leather jacket that had seen better days. His dark hair was a bit messy, like he hadn't bothered to comb it, and he had a few days of stubble on his face. Richard's first thought was that there had been some mistake. This was first class. People dressed appropriately here. They understood the unspoken rules of luxury travel. You didn't show up looking like you were heading to a rock concert or a construction site. The man settled into his seat and turned with a friendly smile. "Hey, how's it going?" Richard gave him the briefest of nods and immediately looked away, pulling out his phone. He didn't want to encourage conversation. In his mind, he was already annoyed. How did this guy even afford a first-class ticket? Maybe he'd used credit card points or gotten some kind of charity upgrade. Richard had seen it before. People who didn't belong in first class somehow sneaking their way in. The flight attendant came by, a professional woman in her 30s with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Can I get you something to drink before we take off?" "Champagne," Richard said without looking up from his phone. "Just water for me, thanks," the man in the leather jacket said pleasantly. Richard couldn't help but smirk slightly. Water, of course. Probably couldn't tell the difference between champagne and sparkling cider anyway. As the flight attendant walked away, Richard made a show of adjusting his position, angling himself even more toward the window. He wanted to make it clear that he wasn't interested in being friendly. Some people might think he was being rude, but Richard called it maintaining boundaries. He'd worked too hard to get where he was to waste time on random strangers. More passengers filed onto the plane. Richard noticed a few of them glancing at his seatmate with odd expressions. One older woman actually did a double take and smiled, but the man in the leather jacket just gave her a small, humble nod. Weird, Richard thought. Maybe the guy was some kind of local character or something. The flight attendant returned with their drinks. As she handed the water to Richard's seatmate, she seemed extra attentive, her professional demeanor warming into something more genuine. "It's really nice to have you with us today," she said quietly. Richard rolled his eyes internally. Great. The guy was probably a frequent flyer who charmed the staff. Those types annoyed him most of all. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Richard pulled out his laptop. He had spreadsheets to review, emails to answer, and a proposal to fine-tune. Work was his escape, his validation, his proof that he was better than where he'd started. The man next to him pulled out a book. Richard caught a glimpse of the cover. Some philosophy thing. He almost laughed out loud. Of course this guy read philosophy. Probably thought it made him look deep or intellectual. Richard had no patience for that pretentious nonsense. He dealt in facts, numbers, and results. The plane took off smoothly, climbing into the clear California sky. Once they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant came around with warm towels and another beverage service. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked Richard. "Another champagne, and keep them coming," he said, still focused on his screen. She turned to his seatmate. "And for you?" "I'm good with the water, thank you." After she left, Richard muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. Some people really stretch their budget for these flights. The man in the leather jacket glanced over, a slight smile on his face like he'd heard but wasn't bothered. He went back to his book.